They called this place God's country once. Long highways laid like veins across a body too big to feel. Red dirt that stains your boots for days. Churches that never lock their doors because sin has a way of letting itself in. Texas, early 90s. A heat so dry it makes bones feel older. I remember the first drive out. No radio, windows down, the smell of creosote and something like dust burning. The sky looked endless, but in a way that felt less like freedom and more like judgment. They told me the killing started in spring. That's what the paperwork said. A clerical season, a date you can circle. But if you've worked the kinds of cases I've worked, you learn that evil doesn't begin on a calendar. It germinates, it hums. It waits for a person who is tired enough or desperate enough or holy enough to listen. And then it uses him like a mouth. His name, the one we learned later, was Elijah Marek. I have written it in 100 reports, and still it feels like a lie in my mouth. Because if you looked at him the day we first crossed paths, you wouldn't see a monster. You'd see a man who had learned how to pass. He could watch a room and mimic its temperature, warm enough to be welcomed, cool enough to be forgotten. That was his gift, and our curse. The first scene sat 30 miles west of Lubbock, behind a one-room church that had been empty since the late 70s. A field of sun-bleached grass, a fence leaning the way old men sit, and a narrow door that opened on its own if the wind chose to think about it. The woman lay 10 paces from the steps, palms cut and turned upward, a hymn book under her head like a pillow, eyes open to a sky that did not blink. No pooling, no frenzy, no chaos to read, just deliberate stillness, a kind that felt less like mercy and more like instruction. Ritual, the county sheriff said, because he needed a word that would let him sleep. I crouched and watched dust drift through a shaft of light. There were 3 small piles of ash arranged in a triangle you'd miss if you didn't kneel, and a single word carved into the church door where a palm would press, redeem. The letters were shallow, exact, not clawed, not frantic. A person with a steady hand and a steady heart did this, or a person who had practiced steady more than most. We processed the scene by the book, photographs, casts, fibers, the choreography that makes people believe science can hold evil still. But there was nothing to hold. No prints, no trace blood, no hair. The hymn book had been handled with gloves, the ash tested as burned pine, and something else that baffled the lab until we found the same compound at later scenes. Powdered limestone, the kind that makes old church walls stubborn as bone. Whoever he was, he wanted the past in the room. When the coroner was done, I stayed. The others called it a habit, my way of telling myself I'd given the dead more than paperwork. But the truth is simpler. I was listening, not for voices, for rhythm. Scenes have tempo. This one moved in 3s. 3 ash piles, 3 steps between them, 3 cuts in each palm. I wrote 3s in my notebook and boxed it. Underline once and you're curious. Underline twice and it owns you. I underlined it twice. A week later, a drifter turned up in a dry arroyo 50 miles south, a man whose name the world had stopped asking for, hands pierced and tied to a wooden frame like a crude letter. The same word scored just under the collarbone. Redeem. The frame was driven into hard earth so cleanly it looked like math. Again, no spatter, no chaos. A wrongness scrubbed to within an inch of ritual purity. I could hear my first training officer saying it. There are killers who feed on frenzy, and there are killers who starve for control. I knew which one we were hunting. People filled the town with explanations the way a body fills itself with breath. Cults, Satanists, cartel adjudication, performance art. But explanations are noise. The pattern was the only honest thing in the room. Palms cut, wounds washed, bodies placed. The radio in a nearby truck was stuck between stations, bleeding static so thin it sounded like air whispering to itself. I made a note of the frequency by reflex, knowing later I would hate myself for it. 666 kilohertz. Too obvious to mean anything. Too theatrical for a man who worked like a surgeon. But he'd parked it there and left the key one click forward on purpose. He wanted us to hear what was missing. We canvassed. We got nothing. A woman at a laundromat said she remembered a quiet man who folded his clothes with the attentiveness of grief. A gas station attendant thought he'd seen a pickup with no plates, primer gray and clean as a prayer. People remember shapes when fear asks them to. The shapes led nowhere. I tried to picture him, not his face, but his weather. How it would feel to stand near him. I've interviewed men who look like threats and men who look like furniture. Elijah would be neither. He'd be a room temperature. That forgettable ordinary that makes you let your guard down. That's the kind of man who can carry a body in pieces through a town, and all anyone sees is a neighbor moving furniture. The third scene changed the air. 3 bodies arranged in a circle behind a shuttered radio station outside Abilene, a triangle that completed itself. A broken radio on a milk crate in the middle, its needle taped to a dead frequency. A steady thrum of something that might have been nothing. Each victim's hands cleaned and folded, each mouth closed with a single stitch like a ceremonial lie. On the cinder block wall, drawn small and low the way a child does when it expects to be caught. A set of 3 concentric circles in gray chalk. Not a cult, not amateur. A notation, as if sound had been given geometry, or geometry had been asked to become prayer. He left us a page torn from a King James Bible, damp at the edges where fingers had held it. Psalm 88. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps. On the back, in block letters careful enough to be taught, even silence has a voice. I didn't like that sentence. It felt like he was telling us where he lived. I didn't sleep much after that. Cases either keep you up or put you down. This one made me walk at night. I'd sit on the motel bed and stare at the AC grill and listen to nothing. People think silence is quiet. It isn't. It has texture. It has edges. The more you listen, the more it presses back. After a while, I could tell when a room had been forced to be still. The same way you can tell when a face holds a smile that hurts. We pulled phone records and power logs, mapped church closures and county fairgrounds, cross-checked missing persons who wouldn't be missed. I kept coming up empty except for 3s, the number rising through mundane data as if it had decided to speak. 3 churches along a 200-mile line had been vandalized over the past 5 years. Not spray paint, not theft. Candles stolen and returned. Hymnals reshelved out of order so that if you sang by page number, the songs bled into each other and died. The kind of mischief that means nothing until it means everything. A deputy up in Childress mentioned a boy who used to sit in the back pew alone in the early 80s, hands folded, eyes closed, mouthing words that didn't match any amen. Quiet as a grave, he said. Never blinked. Preacher's kid, I think. People remember children poorly, but patterns remember perfectly. I drove east to the trailer that rumor said might have belonged to a family named Marek. Sun-rotted panels, a door that couldn't choose a color, lawn chairs no one had the faith to sit in anymore. The neighbor said the father drank through his sermons and the mother hummed like a broken radio. The boy dug holes that didn't hold anything. Quieter than even quiet, the man said, as if he feared the boy might still be under the yard listening. I found nothing admissible, but I found a feeling, a rhythm in the dust. There were 3 shallow depressions behind the trailer where someone had set something heavy and then moved it just far enough to make a point. The ground remembers weight. I put my boot in one and felt the give, the way an old wound tells you rain is coming before the clouds decide. I told myself I was imagining, a professional lie that never ages. He sent a letter to the local paper a week later, not to brag, not to confess, just to instruct. The body is an echo, it read. The soul is the sound. When one breaks, the other answers. No signature, no fingerprint, but the cheap newsprint held a ghost of a smell I could not name. Not bleach, not smoke. Something like the inside of a church on a weekday afternoon, when no one's praying and the air is full of waiting. The letter editor said it arrived with no stamp in a stack of delivered mail. "Maybe I put it there," he joked. No one laughed. I knew then that he'd done what the worst of them do. He'd moved into an idea so thoroughly that he could use other people's hands without touching them. Fear is a conductor. Ritual is an amplifier. Give a town a rumor, and it will build you a church. The fourth scene gave us a piece of him, and I hate to admit I felt relief. A cattle tank out past Sweetwater. Water low enough to show the rim of bottles someone had dropped there in a circle years ago, the way teenagers do when they want to dare each other later. Floating between them, a man, early 30s, a barback from a honky-tonk. No one remembered until the jukebox went quiet without him. His wrists were bound in front with a leather belt that had notches cut in threes. The belt was new. The notches were old, a habit turned into a weapon. He'd left the belt like a calling card and a test. "Find me," it said, "but only if you can count." We ran purchases in a 3-county radius. Leather workshops, feed stores, flea markets that sold belts to men who didn't ask for receipts. 3 belts sold with that exact buckle in the last 6 months. 2 to men who had alibis ugly enough to be true. 1 to a mechanic in a town where the only thing that keeps people honest is heat. The mechanic's name? Elijah. No middle initial. No credit. Cash. Exact. The clerk remembered his hands. Clean. "Cleaner than a man who works with engines," he said. "Cleaner than a man who works with anything." We finally had a shape that could wear a face. I won't pretend that I felt victory. The longer you do this, the more faces look like placeholders for whatever darkness is currently renting them. But it meant I could knock on a door and tell whoever opened it that the world had narrowed enough to be spoken to. The shop owner said Elijah lived out near Palo Duro, in a shack he'd fixed from scratch, like a man rehearsing a sermon no one had asked him to give. I went alone because sometimes teams make a monster feel famous. And I wanted whatever I was about to meet to feel small. The road there was a stuttering suggestion cut into caliche, the kind that convinces you the horizon has been lying. The shack looked like a wooden apology, windows rimed white with dust, a door that had decided to split and then reconsidered. I knocked. Nothing. I pushed. It yielded like it had always planned to. Inside, mirrors, dozens, cracked and hanging at angles that made the room feel like a throat. In their shards, I saw myself over and over, smaller each time, until I felt like a thought someone had decided not to finish. On a chair in the center, a tape recorder, cheap, stubborn, running. I pressed stop and the world felt less balanced. Then pressed play because part of me needed to know the pitch of what had been stalking the edges of my sleep. Breathing, measured and careful, like counting coins in a church collection plate. Then his voice, level, intimate, as if he were standing behind my shoulder and trying not to startle me. "The body is an echo," he said. "The soul is the sound. When one breaks, the other answers." He waited like a man letting God speak next. "Do you hear it now?" I stood a long time after the tape clicked. I think I was waiting to hear my name, not because I believed he knew it, because that's how you feel when someone has taught a room to pay attention. You feel named. We didn't catch him that day, or the next week. He had learned how to sit inside emptiness until it put its hand on his shoulder and called him son. The kind of man who can walk through a county in daylight and leave only the memory of someone polite. I wrote 3 sentences in my notebook that night and underlined none of them. He kills to construct. He constructs to converse. He will stop when he is heard. That last one bothered me more than it should have, because if there's one thing a desert knows how to do, it's listen. I wish I could tell you we moved fast after that, that the machine turned like a key in a good lock. But the truth is uglier. We missed him by minutes twice, by hours once, by a whole week when a storm took the highway down to one lane and timing wrote its own alibi. By late summer, the state line looked like a boundary a child had drawn with a broken crayon. Violence bleeding over it like it didn't matter. He left us ash, chalk, pages, belts, mirrors. He left us with the feeling that we were the ones being arranged. I started to dream in threes. 3 taps from a motel radiator. 3 mouthfuls of coffee before the taste turned metallic. 3 streetlights that went out when I drove under them and came back on in my rearview mirror like a thought I had not earned. This is the part of an investigation where the case stops being a file and becomes a room you live in. You sleep in one corner and wake up convinced the rest of the furniture has been moved while you were gone. It was a bartender in a town so small it had a church and a bar sharing a wall who finally gave us something that sounded like a pulse. "He's not mean," she said, wiping a glass that still looked dirty. "He's neat. He tips exact. He sits with his back to the mirror because he doesn't like how rooms double him." She remembered his watch. Cheap, square, digital, set 3 minutes fast. "He looks at it like it's a rosary," she said. "He waits for the numbers to line up and then he breathes different." I wrote it down and told myself I did not believe in signs. I was wrong. Or I was right in the wrong way. Breath is a metronome if you let it be, and a man who wants to feel God will learn to count time like a choir boy who never got to sing. This is where I stopped pretending I was only a detective. By the time I drove back out into that hot, merciless afternoon, I was something else, a listener. When the wind died, I held my breath so the silence could finish its thought. And somewhere under all that bright sky and dust-locked road, I heard it for the first time, not as a coincidence, not as paranoia, but as a thing that had finally decided to introduce itself. A low, steady hum, 3 beats on, 2 beats gone, repeating like a promise. "Do you hear it now?" he'd asked on that tape. I did, and I understood with the kind of certainty that feels like trespass, what he had been building this whole time. Not an altar, not a grave, a conversation. That's where part A ends for me. In a truck that had started to feel too small for the sound inside my head. On a road that stretched so straight it felt like a moral lesson. With a sky that wouldn't stop watching. I thought the desert would stop talking once the evidence was bagged. But out here, even silence echoes. You drive long enough through West Texas dust and you start to realize the sound never leaves you. It just hides under the hum of the tires, waiting for you to remember. 3 weeks since the first body, 3 different counties, 3 sets of hands opened like prayer. I kept writing that number until it felt less like data and more like scripture. Every case has a rhythm. This one pulsed in 3s, and it beat against the inside of my skull like a clock that had forgotten mercy. People in Lubbock started locking their doors again. Sheriffs doubled patrols that wouldn't find a thing. Reporters called it ritual. Preachers called it the devil's handwriting. And me? I just called it organized madness, because nothing about it felt like chaos. Every cut, every placement, every burn pattern, measured, like someone dissecting faith with surgical calm. I kept the crime scene photos on my passenger seat, not because I needed them, but because I couldn't stand the empty chair. Sometimes when the light from a passing truck hit the glossy paper, I swore the faces moved, just slightly, as if they wanted to finish whatever prayer he'd started. The bureau analysts talked in clean words, typology, psychopathy, ritualization, but language can't cage a man like this. He wasn't killing for pleasure or rage. He was composing something, each victim a verse, each scene a stanza, and somewhere between the lines he thought he could hear God breathing back. That night I drove toward Abilene, chasing nothing but a hunch and static. The radio dial trembled between frequencies, and in the crackle I heard it again. 3 pulses, 2 drops of silence. The same rhythm we'd found etched into wood and ash. I pulled over, engine running, desert stretching infinite around me. When the wind died, the hum stayed. It was faint, like electricity trapped in sand. I realized then he wasn't just performing ritual, he was broadcasting it. Back in the motel, I spread the photos on the bed, marked every triangle with red pen. 3 churches defiled, 3 crosses missing, 3 people who had never met, yet somehow fit like chords in the same dissonant song. I stared until the pattern started staring back. When you hunt long enough, the map becomes a mirror. Morning came slow, hot, cruel. Coffee burnt, nerves fried. The sheriff called. Another scene south of Snyder. A campsite, 3 stones, a melted candle. The victim was different this time, younger. A girl, 16 maybe. Her hands were folded like she'd agreed to die. And beside her, in the dirt, an empty Polaroid frame, face down, its white edge stamped with ash fingerprints. On the back, written in pencil soft enough to almost fade, "Do you hear him too?" The words crawled under my skin. I could see her saying them, soft voice, trying to please. That's how he found them, the obedient ones. He didn't need chains. He just needed faith bent far enough to break. We pulled a cassette from the fire pit, half melted, half saved. I shouldn't have played it. 10 seconds of static, then her breathing, then his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't be afraid. The silence listens." And 3 knocks on the microphone. Click. End of side A. I sat there long after the tape stopped, because what scared me most wasn't the words. It was how calm he sounded. Like a man reading bedtime prayers. Like a man certain he was loved. That night I wrote a line in my notebook. He doesn't kill to speak to God. He kills to feel God speaking back. Then I closed the book and couldn't open it again for 3 days. The investigation bloated. Feds, pastors, journalists. Everyone wanted a headline to worship. They called him the prophet of dust. He would have smiled at that. Attention was oxygen, and we just taught him how to breathe deeper. One afternoon, a call came from a plumber near Sweetwater. He dug into a septic trench and hit something solid, a crate sealed in wax. Inside, 30 undeveloped Polaroids, each labeled with a verse from the Psalms. The last one blank, numbered 33, the same number of vertebrae in the human spine. A ladder to heaven if you believe enough fairy tales. We developed them under red light. Each frame showed the same chair in the same room, first empty, then occupied by a kneeling man. In the 12th photo, his reflection looked straight at the camera while his body faced away. By the 23rd, the reflection was smiling. By the 29th, the chair was empty again, but the mirror still held a face. I've looked at that photo more times than I've looked at my own family. Sometimes I think it looks back. Sometimes I think it forgives me. Forensics found fibers from a denim work shirt in the crate. The kind sold at a hardware store 2 counties over. 3 shirts purchased the same day, paid in cash. Receipt signed A. Marek. Finally, a name to curse. I tracked him through silence more than evidence. His trail wasn't blood, it was absence. Abandoned motels with clean drains, church basements scrubbed too well, dogs that barked at nothing 3 nights in a row. He moved like a prayer that no one wanted to admit they'd said. I started dreaming about him then, always the same. A church with no cross, windows blacked out. Elijah sitting in the front pew, hands folded, head tilted, listening. When I whispered, the whole room breathed with me. When I stopped, it kept breathing. And just before waking, he would say, "You hear it now, don't you?" I'd wake with my pulse counting in 3s. Tap, tap, tap. Then 2 beats gone. The rhythm of his faith grafted onto mine. The department psychiatrist called it secondary exposure. Said I'd stared too long into the abyss. Maybe. But I've learned the abyss isn't a hole. It's a mirror. And mirrors never blink. Late August brought the 5th scene. A barn off Highway 380. Candles burned to puddles. mirrors angled toward a tape recorder still spinning air. On the wall, written in soot, he finally spoke, but the tape was blank. No voice, no hum, just magnetic silence, clean as confession. That's when I understood. He'd learned to record nothing, to make silence itself the message. He wanted absence to preach. He wanted us to feel the void and call it holy. After the lab confirmed the tape was wiped intentionally, I sat in my car and turned off every sound, engine, phone, breath, and still I heard him, not his words, his rhythm, a patient, relentless heartbeat against the glass of reality. 3 beats on, 2 beats gone. You can't file that kind of evidence. You just live with it. I started living inside his timing. 3 steps to the car door. 3 breaths before I spoke. 3 seconds between each note on the recorder. Every move a replica of his ritual, because if I could match his rhythm, maybe I could understand his faith. Faith. That's the word no one in the Bureau wanted to use. They said it sounded unscientific, but faith was the only language this case spoke. He wasn't chasing power or control. He was chasing contact, the kind that requires sacrifice. I spent days reading through old church records and medical files from the town he'd grown up in. The trail led to a boy with a quiet father and a mother who sang hymns in the dark. The pastor called him a child too still to be innocent. At 10 years old, he was baptized alone, his parents watching from the pews, hands folded like they were bracing for a storm. The minister held him under a little too long. Witnesses say Elijah didn't struggle, didn't even flinch. When he came up, he whispered something that no one heard clearly. But later, his mother wrote in a letter, "He said the water was empty, that God had left. That's where you build a monster." In the silence after a prayer that goes unanswered, he grew up smart, polite, and vacant. Joined the choir not to sing but to memorize pitch. Worked odd jobs at repair shops and churches. Always quiet, always precise. People said he was helpful. They always say that about men who hide in plain sight. In one job file, a note from his supervisor caught me. He likes to fix things that aren't broken. That line felt like a sermon. He was trying to repair silence, to make God audible again. By his 20s, he started collecting objects, mirrors, old radios, church bells sold for scrap. Neighbors heard music sometimes, then nothing for days. One described it as hymns sung backward. Another said he'd built a room without doors, just walls covered in foil and crosses made from wire. I saw the photos later. They looked less like madness and more like architecture. He was building a church where sound could worship itself. Psychologists call it auditory messianism, when a mind translates loneliness into religion. But to him, it was engineering. Each killing was a test of signal strength. Each body a microphone for the divine. When I visited his old home outside Palo Duro, the air still buzzed with low static. The neighbors said it was just power lines. I knew better. I walked through rooms that smelled of bleach and cedar oil, walls pitted with nail holes in perfect triangles. He'd hung mirrors there once, not to see himself, but to divide light. Every reflection, another frequency, another voice. There was a desk in the corner, carved with one sentence: "To feel God, you must become the echo." I pressed my thumb into the groove of those letters until I felt splinters break skin. That pain, small, clean, felt like a translation. Maybe that's how he felt each time he cut someone open, a moment of clarity where pain and meaning touch. Every file I read dragged me deeper. I stopped asking who he was and started asking what he was becoming. Because men like Elijah don't stay men for long. They turn into vessels, and vessels never stay empty. I found a series of letters in a locker he rented under a false name. Pages torn from Bible margins, sentences cut mid-verse. One read, "The Lord whispers through wounds." Another, "Pain is not the opposite of faith. It is its proof." I could almost hear him say it, slow, steady, loving what he believed. At night, I started hearing footsteps in my own house, 3 at a time. Maybe dreams, maybe echoes. My radio would click on by itself, static humming that same rhythm. I kept telling myself it was coincidence, but I've worked too many cases to believe in that word. There's something that happens to investigators when evil is patient. It starts to train you. You blink less. You breathe with the scene. You learn to mimic what you hunt. And before you know it, you don't feel like a hunter anymore. You feel like bait. The profilers built their theories. A childhood of religious abuse. A repressed auditory hallucination interpreted as divine command. Possibly dissociative identity tied to self-punishment. Every report was accurate and useless. Because Elijah wasn't broken in the way you can fix, he was rewired for worship. The difference between faith and madness is just one answered prayer. In one letter he wrote, "If pain is God's language, then I will speak fluently." That sentence alone could justify anything. A holy grammar for murder. By September, we believed he'd taken on an apprentice, someone to document his rituals. Maybe Lydia, maybe another drifter. We found new footprints outside the latest site. Smaller, hesitant. He'd turned belief into a shared language. And once faith finds a witness, it stops needing proof. I listened to that first tape again in the lab. His voice no longer sounded human. It was steady but hollow, like a recording played inside a church with no roof. When he said, "Do you hear it now?" I heard something under it, a second voice, fainter, trying to answer. That's when I realized he wasn't talking to God anymore. He was talking to whoever was listening. To me. That night I drove back to the first church ruin, just to listen. Moon low, air still. I stood where the first body had been and waited. And somewhere in the wind, faint but clear, 3 beats on, 2 beats gone. Not imagination, resonance, the earth itself remembering. I understood then that this was no longer an investigation. It was a conversation, and he was still talking. When I finally drove away, the rearview mirror caught something in the doorway. A figure standing just beyond the light, hands folded, head bowed. Could have been shadow, could have been reflection. But I swear, it nodded.
You learn after a while that truth doesn't live in evidence. It lives in the quiet between the questions. And that's where he stayed, right between what we could prove and what we feared to believe. The case file was a mountain by then. Hundreds of pages, everyone stained with dust and sweat. Maps, autopsy reports, transcripts of nothing but silence. And in the middle of it all, his name, Elijah Marek. The kind of name that sounds biblical even if you whisper it. And maybe that was the point. He wanted to sound eternal. We traced him through fragments, receipts, tire tracks, grocery lists written in a careful, patient hand. He'd been buying candles, mirrors, plastic tarps, and radios from secondhand stores across 4 counties, always in threes. 3 mirrors, 3 radios, 3 tarps. Even when he didn't need them, it wasn't compulsion, it was worship. Some people pray with words, he prayed with repetition. The more I read his pattern, the more it started reading me back. I could feel him shaping the investigation, feeding it. Each discovery placed like a breadcrumb he wanted me to follow. And I followed, like any fool who mistakes curiosity for purpose. One afternoon we found his handwriting again, carved into the underside of a wooden pew in a ruined chapel outside Midland. The letters were deep, uneven, written by someone who wanted to make the wood bleed. It read, "I am not the echo, I am the mouth that speaks it." The same chapel had been abandoned for 30 years, but the dust on the altar was disturbed, fresh footprints leading nowhere, and a small circular burn on the floor, like the mark left by a candle that burned longer than it should have. We bagged the pew, photographed everything, sent it to Austin for analysis. But I stayed behind, couldn't help it. There was something about that burn mark. It pulsed when you stared at it too long, like a heartbeat trying to remember its body. I crouched down, touched it. It was cold, cold, and perfectly round. And when I pulled my hand away, a ring of ash clung to my skin like a fingerprint that wasn't mine. I didn't tell the others. Some things don't belong in reports. Weeks passed. The Bureau wanted closure. The town wanted a name to bury, but he wasn't finished. And somewhere deep down, I knew I wasn't either. Then came the letter, postmarked from Odessa, addressed to the listener. No return name. Inside, a single Polaroid of an empty chair in a basement, the same one from before, and a note taped to the back. You've learned to hear me, now learn to answer. That was the first time I felt fear, not of him, but of what he thought I'd become. I replayed every interview, every tape, every recording from the last 6 months. There it was, barely audible under my own voice, a low hum synchronized to my breathing. He'd found a way into the airwaves, the frequencies, maybe even into me. For a man who believed silence was divine, he sure knew how to make it scream. We followed the Odessa postmark to a storage unit on the edge of town, unit number 33. Of course it was. Inside, dozens of broken radios stacked like skulls, mirrors covered in cloth, and a desk littered with notebooks. Each notebook filled with numbers, 3 columns, each row a set of coordinates. When plotted on a map, the points formed a spiral, tightening toward the center of a dry riverbed near the New Mexico border. We drove there at dusk, sandstorms in the distance, air thick with iron, the kind of night where the world feels like it's holding its breath. We found the spiral, stones laid by hand, precise and symmetrical. At the center, a tape recorder, running, no cassette inside, just turning and clicking, whirring, recording nothing. I picked it up. It was warm, like it had been held, like it had been waiting, and when I tilted it, sand spilled from the reel compartment, fine, dark, metallic. Later, the lab said it wasn't sand. It was magnetic dust from hundreds of erased tapes. Every confession, every scream, every word he'd ever spoken. Ground down into silence. Standing there under a sky that looked ready to collapse, I realized the ritual had changed. He wasn't chasing sound anymore. He was collecting silence, refining it, like a miner digging for absence. I looked around and saw the footprints again, his, mine, and another set smaller, lighter. The apprentice. Someone had followed him all the way here, and maybe someone still was. When we returned to the car, the radio flickered on by itself. Static, then faint words beneath it. Female, soft. He's closer than you think. Then gone. We tore the car apart. No bug, no frequency match. The signal came from inside the cabin. The tech said it was impossible. I stopped believing in that word a long time ago. That night I sat alone in the motel, recorder running, hoping maybe he'd speak again. Hours of silence. Then faintly, 3 knocks. Then my own voice distorted. Are you ready to be found? But I never said that. Sleep didn't come after that. It hasn't since. We closed the case officially in 1994. Elijah Marek, presumed deceased, cause unknown. But the evidence didn't die. It followed me. Every night, when the house gets too quiet, I still hear the hum. Low, patient, merciful in its own way. And I can't help thinking, maybe he finished his ritual after all. Maybe the silence we live in now, this world where people speak louder than they listen, maybe that's his sermon. You'd think the end of a case feels like closure. It doesn't. It feels like being buried under all the things you couldn't stop. When they called it judgment, I almost laughed. There was no courtroom, no audience, no gavel. Just a field station near the border, an evidence locker that hummed like a hive, and me staring at a photo of a man who might never have existed. Elijah Marek, or whatever was left of him. We found him 3 months after the spiral, or what we thought was him. A burned-out barn 20 miles east of El Paso half collapsed under the wind.
Inside, 3 chairs, one for each of his victims, candles melted down to the floorboards, and at the center, ashes shaped like a man sitting upright. The coroner called it spontaneous combustion. I called it a confession. No body, no bones, just that perfect human outline in soot, and a tape recorder lying inside it still warm. It wasn't running when we arrived, but when I pressed play, there was breathing, slow, measured, and a voice that wasn't his anymore. Every man becomes the thing he worships. Pause. You came to hear me. Now you know what silence sounds like. Then nothing. Just the sound of tape peeling itself apart. The Bureau closed the file that night. They had their story. A delusional serial killer dies in a ritual fire. Case solved. The media wanted monsters with endings, not echoes. So they got one. But I couldn't let it go. The tape haunted me. Its tone, its rhythm. When I slowed it down by half, the breathing split into 2 layers. One deep and steady, the other shallow, panicked. A second person was in that barn. Someone alive. We ran voice analysis. The frequencies matched the missing woman from the motel. Lydia Hale, the supposed apprentice. Except she'd vanished long before the barn burned. So either he'd found her again, or she'd found him first. I drove out there one more time, alone. Whined off the desert, air tasting like metal. The barn was gone now, cleared for construction, but I could still feel the outline of it in the dirt, like heat that refuses to leave. I knelt where the recorder had been and pressed my ear to the ground. It's crazy, I know, but I heard it, faint, rhythmic. 3 beats on, 2 beats gone. That same pulse that had followed me through every scene, like a heart too stubborn to die. Back in the office, I rewound the final tape again. At the end, buried under static, there was a whisper, not words, a breath, timed perfectly with mine. I'd become part of the recording. Maybe that was always his design. The trial never happened. How do you prosecute a ghost? But the file still got stamped, Judgment of the Monster. I suppose every story needs a title. Weeks later, a package arrived at my doorstep, no return address. Inside, 1 mirror shard, wrapped in black cloth. On it, etched with acid, "To feel God, you must become the echo." Same handwriting, same patient stroke. But when the lab tested it, the chemical residue didn't match anything from the case. Someone new had written it, someone who'd learned his ritual. I didn't report it. Maybe I should have. Instead, I locked it away, told myself it was over. But some nights, when the house goes still, I hear the click of a tape reel starting on its own. And I know silence travels. It doesn't end. It just changes address. Sometimes I wonder what drove him to chase the divine through blood and circuitry. Was it madness? Loneliness? Or something worse? The belief that God was listening, but only to those who made enough noise. Maybe he wasn't wrong. Maybe the universe really does need violence to hear us. Because when people scream, the stars seem to blink. In the end, all that remained were echoes. Mine, his, theirs, folding into one another until you couldn't tell who started them. And maybe that's the point. We spend our lives recording, confessing, praying into the dark, waiting for an answer. But the abyss never answers in words. It answers in reflection. The mirror in evidence room B still fogs on its own. Every 3 a.m., no air conditioning, no draft, just breath. I don't clean it anymore. Some things deserve to be seen only through haze. Before I transferred out, I wrote one last note in the file. No one will read it, but I had to. Evil is not the absence of God. It's the persistence of the search. Then I closed the folder, turned off the light, and listened, not for words, for that thin vibration in the air that tells you something is still alive, just quieter now. And in that silence for a moment I felt him again, not as a monster, not as a man, but as an echo, finally answered. They told me to let it go, that some cases aren't meant to be understood, but understanding was never the problem. It's what happens after, when you understand too much. Years have passed. The files are sealed, the evidence boxed, the world has moved on. But sometimes when I walk into an empty room and the air feels just a bit too thick, I remember, not the crimes, not the photographs, but the sound, that subtle hum that lived beneath every silence, like the world breathing in. People still ask about Elijah Marek, who he was, why he did it, what he believed, and I always give them the same answer, because it's the only one that still feels true. He was a mirror. He showed us what we look like when we stop pretending we don't need to be heard. There's something ancient about that hunger, older than language, older than faith. The need to feel something greater than yourself, even if you have to create it. That's what he did. He built his God out of sound and blood and the ache of being unseen, and we called him a monster because he refused to hide it. Sometimes I think about that barn, how quiet it was after we left, how the wind filled the spaces between our footsteps like a choir tuning itself for a song no one would ever hear. Maybe that was his heaven, a place where every echo finally found its wall. I've worked other cases since then, fraud, abductions, the ordinary noise of human failure, but nothing has ever sounded the same. It's like once you hear that kind of silence, the rest of the world feels out of tune. I keep the mirror shard on my desk, the one sent to me after the case closed. Under certain light, the etching almost disappears. Only when the room is completely dark can you read the words, "To feel God, you must become the echo." I've read that sentence so many times it stopped being a warning. It's a confession now. Because I did become the echo. We all do eventually. The moment you start listening for what isn't there, you start to hear yourself in it. The human mind was never built to stare into the abyss, but sometimes the abyss stares back so quietly that you mistake it for prayer. I've read his letters again, the ones written in the margins of scripture. He never talked about hate, never about revenge, just connection. That's what makes it so unsettling. Monsters usually want to be feared. He wanted to be understood. And in that way, he won. Because here I am, decades later, still speaking his name into a microphone, still translating his silence for people who will never know what it felt like to stand in that barn. Still trying to turn his madness into something that makes sense. Maybe that's the last ritual. Ours, not his. Turning evil into story so we can pretend it's no longer real. But evil doesn't end. It mutates, it waits, and when the world gets too loud, it hides in the pauses between words. That's where it breathes. That's where it listens. Sometimes I wake to the sound of a tape clicking on. No machine, just the sound itself. And in that moment, I know he's still out there. Not as a man, not as a ghost, but as a frequency that refuses to die. A frequency that lives inside all of us who ever tried to make sense of darkness. So I let the recorder run. I don't say anything. I just listen. And in that endless hum, I hear everything this job has ever taught me. That truth doesn't scream. It whispers. That monsters don't hide in shadows. They hide in the echoes of our own voices. And that the moment you start believing you're different from them, you've already begun to sound the same. When people ask me why I still tell these stories, I tell them the truth. Because if we stop talking about them, they win. Silence is how evil survives. It needs quiet to grow. And maybe that's why Elijah chose me to listen, so I'd never forget what silence can do. Now when the night is too still, I open the window, press record, and let the dark speak for itself. The wind, the distant highways, the low drone of a world half asleep. I don't edit it. I don't name it. I just save the file and label it. Echo of the Abyss. Because that's what we are in the end. Not stories, not sins, not confessions. Just echoes, trying to feel like God for a moment before the sound fades. And in that fade, if you listen closely, you can still hear him smile.